Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone from wherever you're joining us, and welcome to today's webinar titled Medicare Part D Price Negotiation Panel Discussion, featuring expert panelists who bring their perspectives on critical issues around support for Medicare Part D products' fair market prices. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's event, ICON, for making it all possible. I want to take this moment now to introduce the 6 panelists participating in today's session. First up, we have Mark McCoy, Director of Client Engagement at ICON, who has over 25 years of experience in U.S. and global pharmaceutical marketing and specializes in market access communications. He'll also be our moderator for today. Next, we have Dr. Earlene Biggs, Divisional Principal of Market Access at ICON. She has over 20 years of experience delivering insights and strategies, optimizing access and stakeholder engagement for pharmaceutical and biotech companies across the product lifecycle. The third speaker participating today is Bruce Capobianco, Head of Business Intelligence Commercial Solutions at ICON, a thought partner and trusted business advisor to clinical and commercial businesses. Dr. Tanya Obradovich is Vice President of Scientific Affairs and Oncology Medical Strategy at ICON. Her experience includes 20+ years in clinical research as well as medical strategy, leadership of oncology, immunotherapy, drug treatment value, and reimbursement policy. Our next speaker joining us is Key Park, who is Vice President of PMAC Consulting and Patient Insight, Market Access, and Commercial at ICON. Key leads a team of principal subject matter experts with expertise in advanced analytics in the areas of payer, patient, and promotional effectiveness and commercial strategy. Our final speaker with us today is Nancy Risebrough, a Senior Principal within Global Health Economics and Outcomes Research at ICON, who has more than 20 years of experience working in decision analytic modeling, health technology assessments, burden of illness studies, and reimbursement strategy and HTA submissions. And now, without any further delay, I'm pleased to welcome Mark to the floor to join me. Hi, Mark. Take it away whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Mark McCoy. It's great to be here with you today. Medicare Part D price negotiation is the biggest single event since Medicare Part D came into existence 20 years ago. In year one, 10 products will negotiate with CMS, and each year more products will be required to negotiate. On average, negotiation will cost each product $480 million in 2026 alone, according to the CBO. Even if your product is not selected for negotiation, you still may be impacted. Imagine if one product in a class provides CMS with a big discount. Every other brand in that class could be disadvantaged in Medicare plans, potentially reducing their market share and their unit volume. The price negotiation train has left the station. Here's some key dates in the process. The first thing you'll notice is that the folks at CMS do have a sense of humor. The 10 products that are selected for price negotiation will be published on the Friday of Labor Day weekend this year. Then companies will only have 1 month to provide key data to CMS to meet the October 2nd date. So you really need to prepare now, or you need to prepare to cancel your plans for Labor Day weekend. Offers and counter offers are going to happen in the first quarter of 2024. Negotiations will end on August 1st. New Medicare prices will take effect on New Year's Day, 2026. So our next speaker is going to be Earlene Biggs, and Earlene is going to tell us about maximum fair price. So Earlene, what should our audience know about maximum fair price?
Thank you, Mark, and it's great to be here today as well. So maximum fair price is the key to the whole negotiation process. And CMS has some very clear expectations of what they're hoping to gain in the process of the negotiations. So what are the requirements and the steps that CMS has in place as they're looking to define maximum fair price for their negotiations? And as we sort of sift through all of the legal terms and what they have in place so far, there are really three primary contributors to maximum fair price. And of course, it starts with the clinical benefit of a drug. CMS is looking at, in what they've defined, the unmet medical need for the drug and the impact on specific population compared to a therapeutic alternative, as defining that clinical value. And that therapeutic alternative becomes important because as they've laid out how they're going to approach this, CMS is going to use the costs of the identified alternatives as sort of the starting point for how they develop their initial offerings in the negotiation process. The second contributor, once clinical value has been determined by CMS, is manufacturer-specific information. And as they've laid out the requirements, whatever their initial offering is or where they expect to go with that, so they're going to make adjustments based on those that manufacturer-specific data and information. The important thing here is that CMS is requiring manufacturers to provide that data in advance of the negotiation for them. And that data is all-encompassing, as well. It's going to include, R&D costs, and what has been recouped of those costs by the manufacturer. They're looking for distribution and manufacturing costs, revenue and sales, as well as data around, has the manufacturer received prior federal support? Are there any patents in place? What's the exclusivity of the product? So a lot of data and information that the manufacturers have to compile and prepare to deliver to CMS in advance of the negotiations. And then, of course, the third contributor is really the whole purpose of the negotiations, and that is, what are the federal targets for savings that have been set? And those are quite extensive, as Mark had mentioned. So that makes up the three contributors that we see. So what does that really look like in terms of the facts? What are the core facts that we really need to pay attention to around the federal fair price, maximum fair price? And what we really see is that first, the negotiations, the negotiated price is technically a price for 1 year. And while there's some acknowledgement that there will be renegotiation after that year, it's not clear what that looks like. No parameters have been set. So it's important to keep in mind that while this is set for 1 year, if you're in negotiations or targeted for negotiations, you really need to think about not just those short-term outcomes and impacts, but what's that longer-term impact? Because what happens after that first year in terms of the price negotiation is an unknown. So you need to be prepared for a lot of different scenarios or alternatives in the longer term. The second thing is the timeline. As Mark mentioned, the train has left the station and we're already in progress. And the products will be announced in September. Data needs to be submitted to CMS within 30 days, and the final offer for a targeted product in negotiations, the final offer will be sent out on July 15th. So not a lot of time to prepare, identify what your strategy is, put together your information. So that's an important fact that needs to be taken into consideration. And then the last kind of fact is, what is the end goal for CMS? And again, significant cost savings that they're looking for an average of $480 million in savings per drug that they're negotiating. And to accomplish that, they've actually put there's actually a cap in place on what the fair market value should be. And that cap establishes, for products that are in negotiation, the best case scenario that you can hope for. So depending on if your drug is categorized as a short monopoly drug or a long monopoly drug, meaning that it's been on the market more than 16 or more years, you can sort of estimate kind of what the best case scenario is for you in terms of what that maximum fair price is. And then the negotiations kind of begin there, right? So that's a really important fact to keep in mind as we're preparing to engage in the negotiations, putting together our data. So what that really means for us as manufacturers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and support services and systems that help them through that. There are 3 takeaways, right? CMS has clear expectations of what they want to negotiate, and they've set those caps so that they can achieve their outcome. And as we're preparing for those negotiations, it's important for us to understand where our position is we're trying to minimize additional reduction in the fair maximum price based on the cap, right? We're negotiating to meet the cap so we can achieve that best case scenario. Therefore, our strategy needs to include data and building that case that says our clinical value supports achieving at least the cap for our maximum fair price. And with little time to prepare that data, we need to be thinking now about not just what our sales or our R&D costs are, but what are the alternatives that are going to be considered or compared. What's our comparative effectiveness? What unmet needs are being addressed? And is there some real world evidence that we can begin to compile and put together for those negotiations? All of those things we need to be thinking about now. And then, the timing, right? The negotiations will be decided and prices posted really quickly. And if there's if, for example, for biologics, if you have a case where you think you should have delayed negotiations, you need to submit those applications by May. So we need to start taking actions even before we know what drugs are going to be negotiated. And we need to be prepared to respond really quickly when that happens. So those are important takeaways for us as we begin to plan for this. And that's the challenge, right? A lot of uncertainty. We're pretty sure of what drugs may be in the top, but are they going to be selected or not? Will they be selected in this round or in future rounds of negotiation? And if our drugs are not in a situation where they'd be selected, will one of the other drugs in the therapeutic area be selected? Because those are also going to have longer term impacts on the whole category if a fair maximum fair market price is determined that either is below the cap or can be at least approach the cap, and that's really what we're looking for. So there's a lot of fallout that can happen whether you're a negotiating product or not, and we need to think now and start putting together the scenarios, building those case studies, compiling the data, because we aren't going to have a lot of time to respond when things start rolling out once the drugs are announced in September. So the first question that needs to be answered for us is, what are the drugs that are going to be selected? And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Key Park, to speak to us about what those drugs are.
Hey, thank you, Arlene, and good morning, everyone. And to Arlene's point, that's probably a question on a lot of your minds, is the product that you guys are responsible for, is it going to be on this list to negotiate for maximum fair price? And so what I'll be overviewing is the different inclusion as well as exclusion criteria, and discuss what data sources are available to see where each product may fall on this top Medicare expenditure list. So under the Inflation Reduction Act, HHS was required to establish a negotiation program for MFP, or maximum fair price, for all Medicare drugs. So specifically, CMS bears the responsibility of implementing as well as administrating the program to select a list of products each year, publish that list, enter into negotiations and agreements with the manufacturers for MFP, and monitor for compliance and enforce any monetary penalties if there are any. So CMS will be using PDE data, which is prescription drug event data they collect from their plan sponsors to calculate the top expenditure drugs for the 12-month period time ending May 31st, 2023. So CMS will first identify a list of all qualifying drugs, limit it down to about 50, and apply some exclusionary criteria, and ultimately ending up with the top 10 drugs, which will enter the first round of negotiations for the applicability year of 2026. So at a very high levels, these exclusions include certain drugs that are categorized as orphan disease drugs, all human blood and plasma-derived products. Small biotech drug products may also be excluded. Biologics that have pending biosimilar launches may also be excluded. And specifically for MFP, Part B won't come into play until the applicability year of 2028. However, it will be used in 2026 to exclude certain drugs that combine both Part D and B spend and qualify based on the amount of money that they, or the revenue they generate. If it's under $200 million for that same 12-month time period, they will automatically be excluded under this low spend Medicare exclusion criteria. So how is a potential selected drug or product defined? The way a single source product is defined by CMS is by combining all forms and strengths of a drug with the same active moiety, including repackaged and relabeled products, authorized generics, and multi-market approval products. So for example, if an entity holds multiple NDAs for products with the same active moiety, and that entity produces multiple strengths under NDA 1, produces different formulations under NDA 2, and so on, plus a different entity B repackages various forms of the same drug and sells products under those same NDAs, all of these products will be classified as one single source drug and calculated all together to determine the overall revenue and the cost associated with it in terms of the ranking. The other nuance is fixed dose combination drugs, as they will not be combined with a single entity product and will be treated as two separate drugs. So for example, Januvia versus Janumet and Flovent versus Advair, they will not be combined, and each product will be created separate in terms of the calculation for expenses. So qualifying for drugs and biologics, there's a lot of similarities, as I mentioned before, in terms of the inclusion as well as the exclusion criteria. However, one of the main differences is the qualification date. The FDA will use the approval or licensure date against the September 1st, 2023 timestamp. So the look back period against that date will be 7 years for drugs and 11 years for biologics. So the kicker here is if there are multiple approval dates for a product, guess what? CMS will use the earliest date possible to make sure that they get full visibility or as much fairness across the board to get the more older products in terms of the qualification. So now digging in a little bit deeper into some of the exclusions. So first, multi-source products will be excluded. And in the memorandum from CMS, it states that drugs, in order to qualify, cannot be listed for any drug approved under a separate ANDA, and a biologic cannot be the reference product for any biological product that falls under Section 351K of the PHS Act. However, they keep on tacking this language around marketed, and the specific term they use is bona fide marketing activity. This term is placed throughout the entire memorandum, but it doesn't explicitly state how they will determine if a product is actively marketed. But at the end of the day, if CMS believes there's bona fide marketing during that 12-month time period ending August 15th, 2023, for any generic or biosimilar, then the index drug will no longer qualify as a single source drug for 2026. To me, this seems a little bit ambiguous. There may be additional language around the definition of actively marketed. However, I couldn't find it in the CMS memorandum. So obviously getting some legal eyes on that would probably make sense for all of you. Another exclusion criteria is the orphan disease exclusion criteria, which states that if a drug or biologic is designated for only one rare disease condition and has an FDA approval for one or more indications within that one rare disease or condition, then that product will not qualify. CMS will be using the FDA FDA Orphan Drug Product Designation Database to validate the status. So if a product fits all these parameters and is in that database, then it should not be part of the negotiation eligible list. There is also an exclusion criteria for drugs that qualify as being manufactured by small biotech companies. So CMS will remove these drugs from the list. However, this is not a passive process. The manufacturer will have to fill out the exemption form to qualify. And in order to qualify, the manufacturer must have a coverage gap discount program agreement in place for 2021. Other criteria is that the overall spend of the product must be less than or equal to 1% of the overall Medicare spend, and the product has to account for greater than or equal to 80% of the manufacturer's revenue under their CGDP agreements in 2021. So that's not confusing, right? So that the key thing here is if you believe your company and drug may qualify, it is important to do the legwork now, do the analysis, put in the paperwork, which ultimately will be due sometime in June 2023. So this date has not been solidified yet. The CMS will let us all know when they do solidify date, but at this point, it is somewhere in June 2023. So definitely, I would get ready, do the analysis, see if you may qualify for this. One other potential exclusion for biologics is that if there is a pending biosimilar launch with proof that there will be a high likelihood that there will be active marketing as well as manufacturer readiness before September 1st, 2025, the reference product may not qualify anymore as a single source product. This one too is not a passive process, and the manufacturer will have to submit a request into CMS by May 10th, 2023. So at the end of all this, CMS will rank all the leftover products after the exclusions against their total expenditures under Part D and come up with the final 10 drugs that will undergo the negotiation process. And if there is a tie, CMS will use the product with the earlier approval dates because they definitely want to make it a little bit more fair for the older products, right? So time is very important. So just to review the timelines one last time, because this is the first gate that obviously lets you, into the race or not. So for biologics, the products must have been approved on or before September 1st, 2012. And for drugs, the approval date has to be on or before September 1st, 2016. The final list of drugs selected for negotiations for the applicability year of 2026 will be published on or before September 1st, 2023. The negotiations starting shortly thereafter in October and ultimately ending somewhere around August 2024. So in summary, will your product be fortunate enough to be part of the top 10 drugs that will be invited to negotiate? So obviously understanding the timelines to see if your product qualifies is critical. And once you determine that, you need to do the analysis to see if any exclusion criteria may apply to your product. The CMS memorandum is out there for public consumption with over 90 pages of light leisure reading for you. So reviewing that in greater detail would be highly advised if you have any thought your product may be on the list. So knowing the criteria is the first step, but also leveraging data that is available to understand product formulations, what manufacturers exist, approval dates, overall costs, and utilization within the Medicare Part D patient population is going to be important to prepare for these potential negotiations. So the PDE, the prescription data event data, is ultimately what CMS will be using. So getting access to that if possible would be a nice to have. However, there are more accessible and real-time data sets available that data providers like Symphony have access to. So reach out to your Symphony contact and see how we can potentially help you in terms of accessing the various data available, as well as support you in the analysis to understand the risk of your specific product being on that list. But I'm going to hand it off to Bruce Capobianco, who will be covering utilization of real-world data versus clinical trial data on providing treatment insights.
Thanks, Key. Good day, everybody. We're going to be talking about actually real-world data and how that applies in this indication. Products selected for Medicare Part D price negotiation will most likely, as mentioned, rely on real-world data as a foundation to support product selections. To set the stage here, real-world data refers to data that is collected outside of clinical trials from real-world sources such as billing data, i.e. claims data, electronic health records, and/or patient-generated data such as registries. I think over time, real-world data has progressively shown that analysis outside the guardrails of clinical trials is more indicative of how a particular drug is performing in the real world across the diverse population with many case examples. CMS is keen to this observation and plans to take advantage of these sources for analysis, specifically focused on Medicare populations, claims data, that is. Research most likely will include observational studies, such as comparative effectiveness, including utilization patterns, safety, effectiveness, clinical benefits, and economic impact through internal analytics associated to this. And this is all fair game from a CMS analysis perspective. My colleague Nancy will be diving deeper into these study types in further slides. And then insights from the studies will obviously influence the drug that's selected as a candidate for negotiation. The timeline is short, as you can see here. To comply, as anticipated, starts on September 1st of this year and ends 1 month later in providing manufacturer-specific data, including cost, market data, sales, so on and so forth, to determine the fair price. And this all the richness of real-world data, in this case Medicare claims data, allows detailed research across the vast ecosystem of perspectives focused on the clinical benefit of the selected drug and their therapeutic value from public real-world input. Several perspectives will be considered both from qualitative and quantitative sources, including potential risks, harms, or side effects, and any unique scenarios or considerations related to clinical benefit, safety, and patient experience. Once the evidence has been considered, CMS intends to adjust the starting point for the negotiation based on this data. The key takeaways really would be to align the evidence generation strategy with inputs from the memorandum from CMS. Perhaps conduct your own analysis for a comparative. Start to leverage patient experience and perspectives of advocacy groups in framing the overall strategy. And then where needed, perhaps consult with experts that work collaboratively in this space from an evidence generation perspective to ensure quality and reliability. And I think we're on to Tanya to focus on more challenges with therapeutics, alternative and pricing negotiations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. The question, once you identify that your product is likely to be under negotiations, the immediate question that comes is, so what would be alternatives that my product would be compared to? So this is a very important question, that preparation for this question also is quite urgent and needs to be thought of immediately. Because based on what we know from CMS as of now, the choice of alternative will be based on multiple sources of information, So, and information about that alternative is going to be quite wide, much wider than what we are typically considering usual package for the marketed drug that is typically supported by the manufacturer generated data, supporting the label and of course the post-marketing lifecycle management. So the source among these sources that you see listed here that are typical as, again, from the data, clinical development data supporting the label. There will be also consideration and inclusion of the data that is public, generated by public and generated by other manufacturers or organizations. That includes also the data by the compendia. That includes the published research articles that research may or may not be part of the involvement with the manufacturer of the drug that will be compared. And it also would be information about the alternatives that is also much wider beyond just the label and the real world evidence post marketing, if available. So this whole question of gathering all of the available information that qualifies to be able to compare and really crystallize the value. The critical term here is the value of the product to be shown to the CMS to support the pricing negotiations. A very important point that has been mentioned, and it has been asked to review of the class. The first step with finding the comparator or alternative, if the drug belongs to a particular class of drugs. We are typically talking about the class, meaning that the compound or the drug has a certain mechanism, molecular mechanism of action, would be to pick the alternative within the class if available. If the drug on the one hand does not belong to any class, it sits on its own, then the other drugs beyond the class that are used for the same therapeutic purpose will be used as alternative comparator. One important point here is that, let's say the question would be whether the unique mechanism of action would support the drug as a unique and uniquely available, and therefore classified as something that does not have alternative comparator. And the answer would be no, because even that it has a unique mechanism of action and may not have the class or similar mechanism, other drug to compare, there would be a comparison to therapeutic alternative drug that may have a different mechanism, molecular mechanism, but it's used for the same medical condition. So this is an important point to remember. So during the clinical development, so to step a little bit further and kind of think about the long-term and preparation for this process, not necessarily for these immediate negotiations, which, the data has to be gathered from already available sources. And by the way, again, from manufacturer-sponsored and non-manufacturer-sponsored sources. But for all of the drugs that are basically certain to go to the market, there is really our urgency to start preparing almost like a dossier for CMS negotiations, although there is quite a long time in, because generation of certain data will take a while. And to think about and start planning, there are basically two very obvious inflection points. One is go to the phase 3 point where the real world evidence plan needs to be aligned, not just to support the label and post-label life cycle, but also the negotiations for the CMS. And as my colleague mentioned, real world evidence, which typically as of now is a retrospective, but this would actually give opportunity for prospective studies that could be much more tailored and better suited for a better comparison to possible alternatives. And also, of course, post phase 3 at the approval time, where this plan for the dossier that supports the CMS and as well as other insurers basically should be really in place and all the studies started. If your drug is already at close to being market, for the approval, then this generation of the data and what would need to start right after the drug goes onto the market would be one thing to think about. And obviously, there has to be alignment overall in all this process. What is critical is to have alignment between medical practice and what is actually needed by the CMS and other insurers, in addition to the typical endpoints that we are thinking when we are thinking about the endpoints submitted to the FDA. So in planning with this clinical development, one aspect of this plan and this package that needs to be emphasized, in addition to what I mentioned, specifically real-world evidence development plan, is to have a really detailed plan about patient voice and gathering the patient voice. And this actually could be the studies that somewhat could be done even now for those that may be under negotiations this year. Because capturing the social media about not just your drug, but actually the possible alternatives and patient voice there is going to be very much needed, as well as the patient advocacy groups positioning and input into current competitor products and medical and regulatory decisions that may have been provided already or could be sought proactively to support really information and gather the data that will show the patient input into drug benefit. Ultimately, really, the goal is to show what is really the distinguishing feature in terms of the patient benefit and quality of medical care, and including the quality measures, by the way. So these are the key takeaways. To also emphasize that at this point, only pharmacological interventions will be considered alternatives. So, for example, the surgery, even available, would not be. Therapeutic alternatives will be looked in both Part D and Part B. In-class alternatives will be the first step to find the alternative. But it will go beyond the in-class, and in case of unique in the class, it will go toward all the other alternatives for the medical condition. Alignment with the clinical and post-clinical development with generation of the CMS targeted dossier is really critical. And depending on your positioning of the drug, you may need to think about, consulting and starting the studies and gathering the data with a different grade of urgency. And very critical overarching in all these steps should be implementation of the patient voice, as this would really critically determine many aspects of the benefits. Patient voice really defines both and is critical for not just efficacy and safety that are typically the first things that we think about, but all the other wider implications for the quality of life and the quality of the care that the patient receives. With that, I will close on this alternative story and actually give a podium to my colleague Nancy, who is going to talk much more in detail about specifics on comparisons between and how you actually go on about comparisons and methodology of your drug versus the alternative. Nancy?
Great. Thanks, Tanya. Just doing a volume check here. Hoping everyone can hear me. So thanks, Tanya, and good day, everyone. I'm going to take us through some thoughts on the types of comparative effectiveness methods in the value assessment to be considering as part of your manufacturer-specific information package. So in light of this, to build the case against the therapeutic alternative, CMS will be focusing on these components of the therapeutic benefit: the population specific to the Medicare population for the comparative effectiveness evaluation, and also looking at the unmet medical need. Specifically about the therapeutic benefit, as I've outlined here, a few of the types of benefits that they have mentioned, not just health outcomes such as progression-free survival. They're also quite interested in looking at symptoms and patient-reported outcomes. They have specifically called out. And so as an example here, CMS will be leading specific literature reviews in order to select these, what are considered the therapeutic targets for the products that are selected, such as progression-free survival or HbA1c control. And will focus the outcomes of importance in the disease from the patient experience. They have reiterated that a few times in their outline. So for manufacturers with products potentially on this first list anyways, it would be helpful to have literature available from this patient perspective to help illustrate. And as an example here for the therapeutic benefit, I'm thinking of in a hematologic cancer, illustrating the outcomes that are of big importance to the patient. So not just progression-free survival, but I'm thinking as an example being blood transfusion-free. For I know there's a number of products that do impact the patient that way, are able to become not requiring any more blood transfusion as part of the benefit of that product. And that would be an enormous amount of benefit from the patient perspective. So be considering that those types of highlights from a patient perspective to highlight to the CMS will be of good value. As introduced by Arlene, comparative effectiveness, which is the head-to-head comparison of therapeutic alternatives for the benefit and safety for these drugs, is most rigorously done in head-to-head trials. But we're impacted here by the populations that they're looking for, and those populations may not be covered in the head-to-head trials, and likely all the alternatives that are going to be selected are not going to be in the head-to-head trial. So they're going to look to other methods for looking at the comparative effectiveness. So specifically, CMS has called out that quality-adjusted life years will not be one of the values that they select or the benefits that they select for be considering. So and what they mean by this is any benefit of extension of life expectancy, regardless of the population, will be considered equal. So then highlighting again here in terms of specifically drilling down to the populations. To reiterate, these are the populations of interest, and we know often that these populations are underrepresented in the clinical trials. So how do you plan for your comparative effectiveness in these populations if you know they're underrepresented in your trials? So we'll need to look to, well, first of all, checking if these subpopulations are large enough in your clinical trials to be considering some subgroup analysis of your trial to help support the benefit in these populations, but then also looking for other methods and other sources of data, such as real-world evidence data sets or observational data sets to consider. So lastly, just before I get to my final takeaway slide, as many of you know, comparative effectiveness research is a very large body of research, and I could be taking up most of this webinar explaining and iterating some of the benefits of each of these types of methods. So I'm just going to give you a little snapshot and overview of some of the things to be considering. Excuse me. And as you may not as I mentioned before, you may not have the head-to-head trial available for these alternatives. And considering other alternative data sources, maybe considering observational trials, data sets to be selecting the patient population that has used these therapeutic alternatives, including the target product, in order to be doing some type of matching controlled type of studies in order to evaluate in a very rigorous statistical way of the comparative effectiveness of the selected target benefit or value. And these, as I mentioned, these observational trials or observational data sets, real world evidence, maybe it's a chart review, maybe it's an administrative database, for example, that is sufficient numbers to evaluate in the patient population of interest, will be very important to Medicare. I have also some additional resources that can be shared for those that are interested following this webinar on these types of research, just as some supportive literature. So then, lastly, in getting to the takeaways to leave some time for some questions, here are the summary from the comparative effectiveness point of view, that showing the relative benefit of the selected products to the alternatives will be a key component to the pricing negotiations. CMS will be most interested in the populations that they cover. And so the comparative effectiveness needs to be geared towards these populations to show their benefit. When no head-to-head trials are available, that's okay. There's still other methods that are available, such as synthesizing of many randomized trials together to have sufficient numbers with the target patient population to do an indirect treatment comparison, or use of real-world evidence. The key is to finding the patient population and the therapeutic benefit target as the main potential for selecting the data source. And we do have some additional comparative effectiveness resources available that I mentioned that I would be happy to share. So back to Bruce now, over to you to take us through some final steps.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. This is Mark. Thank you very much, Nancy. So why don't we wrap up before we do the Q&A? For some overall takeaways from this presentation, we covered a lot of ground, but Medicare Part D negotiation is upon us, and it's going to have a profound impact. And our top 3 takeaways are: don't wait, start preparing now. Don't wait until that list of the 10 drugs selected is published, because you'll only have a month to prepare at that point. Initiate scenario planning now if there's a brand in your class that might be selected. Even if your brand's not going to be selected, what is that impact going to be on your product if that other product is negotiates with CMS? And start thinking about 2024 and 2025. If your brand might be asked to negotiate in one of those years, you should start planning now to do some proactive studies and generate evidence to support your price at that time. So thank you. And I think now we are going to open it up for a Q&A. We have 7 more minutes before the top of the hour, and we could field some questions from the audience. And why don't we think about the question of how much do we believe that CMS is going to value indirect evidence as opposed to direct savings, indirect savings compared to direct savings for the price negotiations? And Tanya, did you want to take that one?
If we are considering the indirect effects, meaning all the benefits to the patient, and also supportive role of the product in improved quality of care, and especially alignment with the established quality of care measures, so that these measures can track the benefit and can even be analyzed as sort of supplemental additional indirect benefits, then it would be expected to be highly considered by CMS, because ultimately the good quality care results from both improved outcomes for the patient as well as decreased cost or improved outcomes with the optimal cost of the treatment. So, for example, supportive care costs and hospitalizations may go down as a result of, that one drug versus maybe all the alternatives out there.
All right, thank you for that. How important do we believe that the patient perspective is going to be in these negotiations? Who'd like to handle that one? Who'd like to take that question?
So I can handle that one. And in reviewing all the materials and the number of times the patient perspective or patient reported outcomes is mentioned, I believe it's going to be paramount in the negotiations. And
I mean, where could some of that information come from where the patient perspective could be?
So first place to look is in clinical trials. And I know most clinical trials have included some patient reported outcomes. But if not in the clinical trials, then be considering some de novo research, if time permits, in order to capture the patient perspective, interviews from the patients to know the importance of the particular outcomes. Potentially would be a good suggestion. Given the timing, maybe for the products that are close to being selected for negotiation, maybe looking for data sources in a database that are already available, considering the timeline, like a real world evidence data set.
And I believe patient advocacy groups and actual experience of individual patients, anecdotal experience would also be very valuable.
Yes, and patient advocacy groups are critical to maybe with some critical questions help with polling their membership and harnessing the opinion and experiences of patients as they have large membership. And it's not just patients, but it's also the caregivers. It's their support in the families and family members that often are actually those that know some of the aspects very well. So in that way, actually advocacy groups, which are composed both of patients and the family members, are really important to, and gathering and basically doing the study, gathering the data, collaborating with them, and supporting even the current negotiations. It would be of importance.
We talked a lot about generating evidence and collecting evidence to support the value of your product, your own product. What about the idea of collecting evidence on the products that you believe would be considered by CMS to be a therapeutic alternative to your brand?
I can take that one again.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Yes, I think it's particularly important to collect some rigorous data on the therapeutic alternatives, especially to know what data is available, that's available either published or in the process or at conferences that will likely come into play. So I think that will be informative to the manufacturers that have their products selected to be well informed and be collecting this information.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that answer. Sydney, we are just about at the top of the hour. Would you like to wrap things up for us?
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. And thank you to all of our expert panelists for being here today and giving those insightful presentations. It was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. In closing, we hope that you enjoyed this HealthEconomics.com webinar sponsored by ICON, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.